welcome everybody. It's a little bit late tonight, but I hope we're going to make a fruitful conversation. Thank you for joining us, guys. So let's talk about ESG in agri-food. So by incorporating ESG into their strategy, companies can do a lot of good, not only for their employees, but also for their financial performance. There's no doubt in that. So my first question, and predominantly to our investors on the stage, would be, what are some key ESG factors that investors should consider when evaluating investments in agri-food? Maybe we start with you.
I can see you eyeballing me there. Yeah, thanks,
yes.
And good afternoon to the audience as well. So just to give some context, Rockstart is an early stage investor. So we're investing at pre-seed up to Series B, but we're always doing our initial tickets very early in the startup's life cycle. We do have an ESG and impact-driven thesis, which means that we are actively screening for those companies that are bringing additionality, basically. So they should be bringing something towards climate improvement or societal change.
Of course.
So we do screen for it, but at such an early stage, it's difficult. What do you look for? There's nothing to measure. So many of the topics we're looking at are qualitative. What's the intentionality behind board and governance, for example, on the G side of things? On an environmental aspect, usually we're looking for something, an impact metric to underpin the environmental ambitions of the business. So we'll be digging into that, the aspirations around what they'd like to do in terms of life cycle and impact down the line with their product. And from a societal perspective, we also look at what their diversity across the team is. So we basically have a large sheet of filter questions that are descriptive and qualitative, and there's very little to measure when we make that first investment. That changes as we get closer to Series A, Series B, which probably a colleague on the right can speak a little bit more to, because you guys are later in your initial tickets.
Sure. So a little bit more of context also about ourselves. Cardomain Capital is an early stage investor. We have been investing for 5 years now as Cardomain, mainly in early stage in Israel. Recently, we decided to also launch an agri-food tech fund. This fund is, by the way, an Article 9 of FSDR, so we do, like yourselves, look at this criteria during the evaluation process, and then also we very much look afterwards during the monitoring and the governance process of these companies. Now, our thesis, if you will, is quite broad. We see a lot of value being created across the entire food value chain. So much like what you were saying, the KPIs that we're going to look at, they're really going to depend based on the type of business that we're going to be investing in, right? And like you, we invest in late seeds and Series A's. So we will predominantly look for this let's say, agreement and binding agreement through the SPA with entrepreneurs that they're going to be aligned with these values, whether it is carbon emissions reduction or better waste management. It really depends on the type of business.
But you guys focus on early stage. You as well, correct?
Yes.
Predominantly early stage, but you mentioned also later stages or early stage?
We'll continue to invest up to Series B.
Okay.
And that's when the ESG and impact measurement aspects become interesting then.
Yes,
so there we're going to be really looking for monthly, if not monthly, at least quarterly reports on specific impact metrics that we've decided upon. Usually this should be linked to some business unit. You want to create an algorithm, so X units of product sold equates to so many tons of CO2 coming down, and we'll then actively report those metrics onwards to our LPs, and you'll be able to see impact. This is where all these impact reports come out as a marketing tool often for funds as well. What I would say is I think one of the things we've been very actively doing at Rockstart is trying to protect our founders from overkill of reporting on ESG and
there is such a trend to do too much.
There's a real it's quite attractive to be either an Article 8 or Article 9 SFDR registered fund at the moment. We are Article 8 light green by decision. It's taken us about 18 months to finally decide, we're going to do that. The reason being that the regulations are not clear enough. They need more clarity on what the bar is, what's the expectation. And if we were to go as far as an Article 9 reporting, the pressure that would put on the founders, when we're investing, it could be a team of 2 or 5 people who are trying to find product market fit. And we have to trust in those founders that the aspirations towards ESG and impact are there and baked into their mission. That's what we're investing in. And then only later, once they've got the resources post-Series A and we've put a larger check down, then our expectations on reporting would increase and become more granular. So.
Interesting. Melina, maybe we...
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to provide a different perspective because both of you spoke about ESG when it comes to startups, so the startups that you invest in. There is the other side, which is ESG in corporates, right? So what are corporates in the agri-sector prioritizing, agri-food sector? And one of the new trends that falls also under the terminology of ESG is biodiversity. So a lot of companies like, let's say, Danone and other food companies are looking at their supply chains and saying, hey, these supply chains need to be more resilient. We need to ensure not only that our carbon footprint is being reduced, but also that we have, the soil to continue growing, for example, the grains that we need, or we need to make sure that the farmers we work with are resilient to the climate impacts. And so when corporates are looking at ESG from that perspective, from a venture capital side of things, it's also an opportunity to look for startups and founders that are solving those ESG pain points to a certain degree of corporates. And one example within biodiversity, a company that we invested in is called Agrina. It's a regenerative agriculture company that is helping farmers transition from traditional agriculture to regenerative agriculture by providing a new revenue line for farmers, which is soil carbon credits, but also financing the transition. And in that model, a lot of corporates, for example, are interested in insetting emissions, but also looking at biodiversity. And this is the perfect type of company that an investor would, well, obviously, if you check all the other factors that you need to check when you're investing, that would solve for this ESG issue within the agri-food supply chain. And just as a way of introduction, my name is Melina. I am a principal investor at Enu. We are a climate tech fund based out of Berlin, Germany, launched last year with 100 million in assets under management. We do seed and Series A, so also early stage in Europe and the US. And we have invested in a couple of food tech and agri-tech companies, Agrina being one of them, and NextGen Foods on the alternative protein side being the other one.
And you're more stage agnostic, right?
Seed and Series A.
Seed and Series A. And do you notice differences, or as he mentioned, between the early stage and the later stage companies?
Well, I totally agree with what you said. So we are Article 9. For those of you who don't know Article 8.9, Article 9 is impact fund. Article 8, you would say, is ESG. Very, very broad terms without going into the details. And yeah, I totally agree. When you're investing in early stage companies, you cannot force, metrics and reporting upon, like 2-3 founders. You need to understand where they are, what resources they have, and then really seed the right terminology and the right ESG factors that you might want them to focus on down the line when they are at growth stage. And definitely that's something that most impact and climate funds and hopefully ESG funds as well know and are aware of. I think there are very few that would force, all the metrics, down to them from day one.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, let's talk a little bit about what are the challenges in agri-food and agri-tech. Maybe from EIT food perspective, you can tell us a little bit more what challenges you currently see, how we can tackle those challenges in the sector.
Okay, so maybe I'll explain a little bit what we do.
Yes, exactly. Short introduction of EIT Food, but it's a very famous name, I guess.
Thank you. So I would say that we are mostly not an investor. We do invest, but this is not our mission. So we are an organization operating at EU level with a mission to help the transformation to the agri-food system into more sustainable, more innovative, and more resilient. So we are a community of 200 plus members, among which we have the largest corporates in Europe, Danone, Nestlé, John Deere, etc. We work with the key research institutions and universities in Europe in the field, and also, of course, we support the startups. So every year we select more or less a little bit at 200 startups, and we support it in all different stages. And then at the end of every year, we invest of our own fund, of our own grant from the EU, I would say. We invest between 2 to 3 million in a few startups, up to €500,000 per startup. So we already have a portfolio of 15, 16 startups. And we also have the view of corporates and also investors. No? So that's, for us, right now, one of the big topics is how to help companies to achieve net zero. And therefore, for companies in the transformation industry, the big challenge is how to reduce their scope 3. And scope 3 for a transformation company, for Unilever, for a Nestlé, for Danone is basically the farmers, the farming part of it. And there are a lot of technology challenges. No? There are many areas in agri-food sector, but then to be able to monitor and to review or to validate carbon sequestration, soil health, biodiversity, you need technologies that are not in place. Because right now you can do it, but it's very expensive. So you cannot do it at the scale. So you have to take samples of the soil every time you want to measure the situation of that particular piece of land at different spots on a particular farm, then it's very costly. So we need to find a way, either by satellites, satellite images, drone pictures, and whatever algorithms. We need to really find a way that is scalable, and we need technology. So when you're working with corporates that are looking at the area that is beyond the huge transformation that is needed from the side of farmers, you need to identify the technologies and to develop the technologies that are able to do so at a cheap way. No? So that's one big piece. Then, of course, maybe we can talk later. There are also other areas. Around the agri-food value chain is so large and so diverse that you find challenges everywhere. No? And when we talk about ESG goals, that's okay, but that's super fine. That's okay. Maybe I was too negative. But then when you talk about agri-food, you always have to consider that whatever you do has to be also healthy. So there is an additional challenge to it, no? Because you can change eating patterns or eating affecting the people, the intake of people, but eventually this in the medium and the long term has to have a good effect, or the effect on the health of people has to be also better. So there's an additional difficulty.
So from investors' perspective, what are the major difficulties or the major challenges in the food tech and agri-tech, and how we can solve those?
Just jump in there, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
The opportunity is clear, right? If we're going to be able to mitigate climate change the way that we want to and to adapt, then the food system is essential. It's touching upon our oceans, which is 70% of the planet. It's touching across soil health and biodiversity that was mentioned there, which is the skin of our planet. And not to mention, it's one of the largest contributors within logistics and processing, right?
Correct.
The challenges, though, are very nuanced. Like if you bring it down to one of the examples that you gave earlier was on corporates' intention and their excitement around insetting. So one of the best insetting tools would be trees, because trees capture quite a lot of carbon into the soil. Though, who's got land? Farmers have got land. Let's put trees on land. Well, no, hold on. The regulation says that if the tree looks like it could be a commercial enterprise, that farmer's not getting the carbon credit. It can't be a spruce tree, which is great, right? Because spruce trees are all lined up, and all of that carbon is in nice rows, all going down into the ground, nice and deep. No, it needs to be like an oak or an elm, which takes a lot longer to grow, and ensures that there's no commercial enterprise on the farm that is going to interfere with the carbon credits that are open to these farmers. So farmers that I talk to, I come from an agricultural background, are saying, why on earth would I take that field and put it into a bunch of elm trees that are going to take the next 15, 20 years to come through, and I'm going to get somewhere between £2 and £8 in the UK per acre. Why would I do that? So that's a big challenge, right? It's coming down to the operational, the business operations of a farm is impacting the overall transition. When we talk about it at this high level, the aspirations are good, the tools are getting better, the insights are starting to emerge. But when you talk to the people who are actually sitting on the land, it needs to make sense to those business models and to their livelihood.
Yeah. I would say also beyond that, one of the main challenges that most of the food tech companies share, although it really depends on the type of company, is the capital requirements now in this state of, let's say, high interest rates, right? Now access to capital is not the same as it was before. It's true, though, that there has been, especially last year, a lot more climate tech funds, if you will, that have begun to invest into food tech. But we see that as a challenge because the reality is that, at least in Spain, there are many funds in the early stages. And then as you move along the growth curve, if you will, there are less and less growth funds. So specialized, I mean. So in this case, what is important for us, I think, as investors specialized in this niche is to actually network beyond our current network of food tech or agri-food tech investors and bring along more generalist investors that already have that dry powder that is going to help the companies grow, right? And also in some cases, definitely not for everyone, but like regulation can be an issue, right? So we, as I said before, we invest in Israel. And Israel, it's an amazing country for technology creation. But it's also a very tiny market, right? It's just 9 million people. So when we speak to entrepreneurs there, they always think, so what's going to be my market? Is it going to be Europe or is it going to be the US? And what we need to bear in mind in Europe as an ecosystem is that if we want to remain competitive and get entrepreneurs to actually launch the companies here, is that regulation should be faster in terms of regulatory approvals from regulatory agencies.
Okay, very, very good point. Okay, while we are on the topic of problems, let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 and how the whole crisis impacted the sector. Honestly speaking, there seems not to have had a big COVID had not a big impact on the sector. Seems the sector is continuing to grow. Do you agree with that? What is your observation after the crisis?
I think it depends on the point of view.
Yeah.
So I think that the good thing of COVID for the sector is that most people and even investors realize that the sector was key. Maybe we never pay attention to how food got in our table. So there was a case for the sector. So there was more eyes on it, also related to different trends, consumer changes, consumer different tastes, sustainability, etc. So they put a focus on the sector, and I think that the sector worked through very well the COVID. But now, not from the startups. I mean, startups. From the startup point of view, still is a good moment because they are fundraising. They have more. If they are fundraising, they have more funds looking at them, etc., etc. For the sector, for SMEs, and for corporates. Now they're facing the Ukraine war, the increase of prices, the increase of raw materials. I mean, that's a huge challenge to keep business as usual because everything has an impact on the consumer eventually. And there are when you look at the farmer side, they're having difficulties to even they keep farms open, especially for livestock. Also, this year it hasn't been great. Now it's raining. I mean, if you are in Spain, Italy, or in the south of Europe, eventually, finally, it's raining. But it's been a very long, very dry year. So that's from that point of view, from the farmers and the transformation industry, is perhaps not the best, no? There's still challenges there.
Melina, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I'm going to focus on the Ukrainian energy crisis. I think that's a lot more present.
Also, yeah.
And also a lot more, it has affected a lot more, I would say, the agri-food sector over the last years. And I think it's both a challenge and an opportunity. Why? And I'm putting here the hat of the startup. So you have, for example, startups doing vertical farming that require a lot of energy, and all of a sudden, after Ukraine and the energy crisis, half of them went bust, and many others are, trying to survive. So definitely that's affected a lot of startups in the food industry that have been working with a lot of dirty energy so far. But it also was an opportunity because the energy crisis, the Ukraine crisis, also increased the prices of fertilizers. And all of a sudden, all these startups that were working on alternatives to fertilizers, could become a little bit more competitive. So I've seen the crisis being both a challenge and an opportunity for startups that are doing vastly different things within the agri-food sector.
Okay, and then from investment perspective, did the crisis change something in the sector?
Yeah,
for you?
I would say the The biggest impact has been on funding and scaling availability for our portfolio companies.
Wow.
Because there's a whole chunk of the world that just stopped engaging. Stopped engaging with it. We work with a lot of farmers out of Denmark and the Nordics who have got their primary production in Russia and Ukraine. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of hectares, where previously we would have startups that would have access to that land to go and test and pilot their products. Suddenly they couldn't do it. Not only that, but those massive farmers were also co-investors of ours who were going into these early stage startups, Danish farmers who've got big production in Russia and Ukraine. And suddenly they're thinking, well, no, I can't, because everything's about to be wiped off. There's a war happening. So that was a real tangible impact. We've also had situations, the human factor is there too. We've had a number of our Russian colleagues across the portfolio who wanted to get out of Russia, or Ukrainian colleagues who either wanted to get back in or out. We had whole software teams based out of Ukraine that needed to take some pretty tough decisions. Most of them chose to stay and engage in the conflict. So there's a real human element to this that is impacting the teams, and there's also a kind of knock-on that means that, at least in our world that I'm talking about within our portfolio, access to that channel of funding and scaling opportunity is just one day to the next was just closed. So.
Okay, I understand. Okay, the next topic I would like to discuss is greenwashing. So for the crowd, greenwashing is basically the practice when our company makes people believe that they're doing more to protect the environment than they really are. So unfortunately, this trend is kind of widespread currently. I want to ask you and the panelists, how are you dealing with the greenwashing problem? What is your secret to tackle this challenge? Maybe we start with the investors first.
Okay, yeah, so we've been operating only for a little, but what we know, and is something that Mark has pointed out before, is that still regulation is at a very high level. And I think that these sorts of problems are going to still happen, so as long as there is no tighter regulation that actually helps people really understand what is sustainable from what it isn't, and what is it actually required for an investment to be considered sustainable, right? With very clear metrics. And I think that this is a road that we need to make all together, and we need bigger support from regulators so that they can actually limit things a little bit more, because otherwise I think this will still happen. In any case, as a GP, governance is key. That is what I can say.
Absolutely. Amparo, you want to say?
Yeah, we work with corporates, and I have to say on behalf of them, and I speak with good word for them, because the ones we work with that are the largest multinationals, they do really believe, and in fact they would like to speed more the goal of towards net zero, but it's difficult for them, and they have difficulties to scale. Some of them I already mentioned. It's true that they have quite some uncertainties around regulation, the carbon removal regulation that is coming in the next years, and also some other areas know about the use of fertilizers that is complex for them. But I do think that they're making efforts, and they made serious commitments to achieve either regenerative inputs or a more sustainable production or net zero goals. And I do think that they're doing right things. That there is one thing around regulation, there is also around certification, because how do you ensure that what you are getting as a consumer, you can trace the value chain backwards, and that has the qualities that you are expecting. So you need traceability solution of different formats and certification. So there is still that could avoid the greenwashing. But I have to say that with the largest and most serious multinationals, they do really believe, and there is a serious case of market demand, because there was a study a couple of years ago from McKinsey on the superior growth of brands and products that have a ESG claim. So that really over the past years, the non-ESG products with non-ESG claims, they were growing 20% on an accumulated period of 5 years, and products with ESG claims, they were growing 28%. So that difference in retail is really meaningful, specifically in retail. So there is a demand case behind that.
Okay, absolutely. And we have to make sure that these ESG investments do not become pure marketing, exercise. We just claim something that is not there. Melina, your short opinion?
Well, from a venture capital perspective, especially being an impact fund, the best that we can do is invest in startups that are helping these corporates green or make their supply chains more sustainable. And we have our own regulation, as you were referencing, on our shoulders to make sure that the startups we're investing in comply with all the ESG requirements that SFDR asks for now and in the future. But I also think that regulation is coming up also for larger companies. I don't know all the nomenclature, CFRD and things like that, too many of them to keep track of. But definitely this regulation is helping us when we invest in companies that then plug into supply chains of big corporates and then ultimately help them. But eventually also this regulation will force these companies to have minimum standards that can be comparable and that can be verified.
Good, thank you. Then let's finish on some positive note, I would say. Give us some success stories for companies that successfully implemented ESG sustainability and brought also financial returns, or some success stories. Huh? I was watching the investors first, but...
Yeah, I can start off. There was a company that we invested in back in 2019 called Agranimo. And this was a company out of Chile originally, and then they expanded their operations to Germany. So they had a kind of LATAM European hub. And what they did was microclimate information for fruit trees.
Okay.
So you'd put a sensor in the ground, and basically using a combination of chemistry and biology and infrared sensing, you'd be able to get a picture of what's happening around that tree. Their ambition was to link that through the supply chain so that retailers would be able to start making a clearer picture of the yield, of the quality, and we would have less spoilage, less wastage, etc. But for the startup team at that time, and also this 2019, there wasn't as much capital flowing into that space. They're finding it incredibly difficult to make the step beyond the farm gate. So yeah, we hooked them up with a company out of South Africa called HM Hall, which is the largest fruit producers and exporters out of South Africa. We did a nice exit for ourselves out of that on a secondary, and they were able to become the digital backbone of that logistics network now. So that's really hopeful. That means the largest producer and exporter of fruit and veg in South Africa have got a 10-year horizon that they're looking at to build out this digital spinal cord through their entire logistics network, all starting from the soil of a tree. So
beautiful.
It was really nice, yeah.
Beautiful. Amparo, any example from you? Success story, quick one?
Maybe I'm
very short.
Okay, so maybe I'll speak for one of our latest companies that went through our programs. It's not huge yet, but they're very successful. They have 100% success when they approach a corporate. They call Bio2Code, and what they do is natural coverage for fruits. You can they extend the life shelf of certain fruits, and every time, the very early stage, and every time they talk to a corporate that is doing or a cooperative, they get the pilot. So that would be a success for next year.
Idea. It's incredible. Thank you so much. Thank you for the participants. Thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.